right, so thanks everybody for coming on a Friday afternoon to learn a little bit about OER. So we're adapting, creating, and talking about ways that you can find materials online and figure out if they're good to use. So this presentation is being recorded and it'll be posted on YouTube on our playlist at the UNM libraries. So we'll just talk about adapting, creating, editing, and have leave some time at the end for questions. So since these are all going to be on YouTube kind of separately, I thought I would just do a quick, super quick definition of OER. As we all probably know, teaching, learning, research materials that are openly licensed on the web and free to use, sometimes also open for us to adapt them. So educators that want to use OER, they can engage in these activities related to modifying the curriculum or saving the curriculum and redistributing them to their students. And so these are the 5R activities of OER. So in this session, we'll be talking a little bit about remixing and revising those materials. So if you're starting with the project super new to OER, what you'll want to do is figure out what is the scope of your project. And so it's kind of hard to tell sometimes at the outset because you may not know what materials are out there. So this is a graph it was created from campus technology, but the data was from Achieving the Dream. And this is a little bit older, but they found from reviewing OER projects that turned into OER courses that it took an average of about 172 hours to go from start to finish. But this is like starting really fresh from scratch. But there's other aspects of creating OER that you may not necessarily start thinking about until you're in the process, but thinking about technology, maybe meetings with other people, refining and editing your courses. That's kind of why they came up with this number because it's everything all together. It can definitely take less. And also it could probably take more time than that. So for the OER program that we have here at UNM that we're using with our NMOER consortium, we've taken this workflow created out of the University of Hawaii and we adapted it for our UNM projects. And so it splits up the production of open educational resources into these 5 stages. So the first one's priming, and I'm going to go in depth into all of these throughout this presentation. But the first one's priming, just learning a little bit about OER. Do you know the licenses and do you feel comfortable? Do you know what you're searching for? So that'll be priming, and you would want to maybe talk with the librarian or someone who knows OER on your campuses. And then you would move on to step 2, pre-production. So kind of like getting everything ready, curating the materials. Scoping would be the next one, and that's where you're outlining and thinking about what goes in there, and then development and publishing. So this is kind of the workflow that we work with when we're talking to authors that want to create or adapt OER materials. So before you get started, you'll want to develop a timeline and be realistic about it. I know people get excited and they want to, use OER for the fall and then they start in the spring, but it usually takes a long amount of time if you are creating the materials or adapting them. So I think it's okay if it takes a little bit longer. So include writing time when you're trying to think about how many hours it might take. You would also want to include these other aspects, leaving time for editing, proofreading, and also time for peer review. So all of those aspects can go into when you're adapting and creating OER. If you want for your department to maybe adopt your materials, then you would also want to include them in some of these processes as well, just to help create some buy-in so people know what you're doing and they can maybe have a voice in the process too. When you first start out with OER, you'll always want to start with like your outcomes. So this process of adapting and creating OER, it definitely has some of the steps that would be included if you were evaluating a textbook. If you're trying to figure out what curriculum you want to teach your students, you want to make sure that you're covering all the outcomes of your courses. For the gen ed courses that we have in New Mexico, they share outcomes. And so When I used to be an English teacher, we worked on OER and we started with these outcomes. That's why I'm sharing these specific ones here. So start with the outcomes, and then you'll also want to consider what kind of material do you want to look for or include in what you're creating for your students. The most free materials are up here. Those are the materials that are in the public domain. They don't have any sort of copyright. And then people can add different licenses to their work. The least free would be the one at the bottom, which is no derivatives. So for these licenses that say ND on them, it just means you can't change the material, but you can distribute it as much as you like. You could include it in, a collection of materials that you give to your students. That would be perfectly acceptable in terms of like the license regulations. And then these other ones just, you just want to remember if you find some OER materials, if you want to combine them together and create something new, you want to make sure the licenses are compatible. And so there's this very gritty grid that tells you which licenses are compatible with each other. So say you find something that's Creative Commons share-alike. Share-alike means if you adapt the material and relicense it, you keep the same license. So you can't make it more or less strict. And then NC just means you can't charge for the materials. So if you found some CC BY SA materials and you wanted to combine them with CC BY NC, you actually couldn't because they're not the same level of open. So this grid would tell you, can I mix them together and create something new? CC BY is the most accommodating of the Creative Commons licenses, and you can mix that with any of the other licenses, and you'll be just fine in terms of following the rules. So what's inside those licenses? Layers like this beautiful cake. When you're assigning a Creative Commons license to your work and you use like the code from the Creative Commons website, like if you use their Creative Commons chooser, you're going to have something that you're putting on your material that is machine readable. So an person who's looking for OER and maybe filtering for a specific kind of license, they would be able to find your materials. Also, another layer of the Creative Commons license is the legal code and then the human readable definition. So whenever you're linking back to the Creative Commons license, you're automatically applying the license terms. And then on the license terms that are human readable by, lay people, not lawyers, they always link to the legal code, which is like lots and lots of pages long. So if you do that, if you link back to it and sort of like stamp it publish it on the web, then you've licensed your materials. So that's just a little bit about sort of like getting to know some of the processes around getting used to OER and learning about it. And then our second phase in our OER creation or adaptation workflow would be pre-production. Sometimes when I talk to faculty, they want to start from scratch and they may not realize that there's already material that are out there that they can use and adapt for their own classes. So before you start creating OER, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. Like the whole purpose of open licenses is to like speed up the process, right, of education and intellectual growth. And so if everybody's starting from scratch, we're moving more slowly. But if you start with someone else's material and then adapt it with new concepts, then you're just speeding up the growth of open education. So it's great to use someone else's stuff and build from that. So make sure you look and try to find materials that are out there in your disciplines. The stuff you need may already exist. It just might be kind of hard to find. There's lots of different repositories that you can search. And then also you can ask a librarian for help if you want to find material that is open. Also, if you find material that isn't quite right for your classes, you can adapt it to meet your course and program outcomes. So that would also cut the time of developing OER curriculum if you could just find someone else's stuff and then adapt it for your students. So one good place to start is the web, and these are just librarian tips that you would get from any library orientation. Google Advanced Search, you can use Boolean searching and pair keywords, Boolean operators, or you could search. You can also filter advanced search with Google. You can filter by license. And then YouTube too, you can search for Creative Commons licensed materials. It doesn't show up on the first page, the home page, but once you do a search, then you'll have the option to filter it by license. So the web is one place to start looking for material. And then there's also repositories and referatories that you can check out to find materials. Searching is like a whole other video, so I'm not going to go into that, but that's just like part of the process. But we have more videos on finding materials and evaluating them. Once you find the materials that you want, there's so many different rubrics that you could use to figure out if it's something that you want to use in your class. Open Textbook Library has this review criteria that you can use to figure out, is this material good? And then I have a couple of other frameworks on here, Idea Framework, and then Evaluate OER from Iowa State University. So a lot of these criteria for finding materials and evaluating them is very similar to if you were doing a textbook search like committee, you would always want to make sure the materials are relevant for your students and comprehensive and things like that. But there's other things that are maybe different from a traditional textbook that you might consider with OER. For example, the interface, does it work well with students? Modularity of the materials can be super helpful because then you can like take chunks of it and put it in different areas of your classes. And then you're always kind of coming back to the outcomes and thinking, am I addressing all of these things that my students need to learn in order to meet the outcomes of my course? So way back in the day, when I first created an OER, these were some of the websites that I used. So this was when I was creating an English OER, and I worked with a colleague. And what we did was we listed sites that we liked. Well, these were the sites that were around like 10 years ago. Some of these don't exist anymore. This is just an example of like how quickly things can change. I don't think Bookboon's around or Boundless, but Boundless used to be pretty cool. So we kept a log of what we liked, and then we ended up deciding that based on the outcomes for our course, we were able to meet all of the outcomes by finding material from 7 different books. And so down here on this little tab down here, it shows you these are the titles of the different books that we were using. So like each tab, we would look at the pros and the cons of the chapters and then figure out, did we want to use this and where did we want to use it in the book, just to keep track of everything. And then also, this is just another different look at the same kind of a process. So, like right here, these are the chapters that are from this book called, let me see, Successful Writing from Lard Bucket. The Google Sheet that we use kind of became like a conversation about the books. We were able to work asynchronously to put a new book together by looking at all of these other texts. So this was 10 years ago, and this was English composition, and the books weren't as good as they are now. So I think now you could find a book and probably apply it to your class, but back then the choices weren't as great, and it also needed a lot of revision too. We had to edit out the racist and sexist things because, sometimes textbooks have things that, are maybe outdated, don't apply to your students, maybe alienate your students if all of the people in the book are, don't match up with who they are and the people that they know. So we would put comments in there and kind of go back and forth and talk about which chapters that we wanted to use. So that was just like the collating, curating process, which is like another step in the process. So another thing that you'll want to consider if you're creating OER or when you want to use OER curriculum is, when should you adapt, or create something completely new? And these are just different lists to kind of help you figure out when you would do those things with the materials that you found. Basically, you can consider adopting if you can't adapt the material at all. Gen Ed courses, those introductory concepts, a lot of them are just already out there on the web. If you could just take like 1 or 2 books and put them into your class and not have to change anything and you would meet all your course outcomes, that would be a great time to just adopt material. You might need to adapt, which is kind of it can be a little bit of a longer process, almost similar to creating something new. But say you find a book and it is on the same topic that your students are covering, but maybe it just needs some more advanced material inserted in different places. That would be a good time to adapt. You could revise the reading for like your students' reading level. You can revise the tone. So when I was working on an English book, I didn't like the tone of the books. I thought they were super condescending. So I wanted to make an English OER that had a conversational tone that would invite students into the book instead of like pushing them out. So we revised like the clunky long sentences and simplified the grammar exercises. Like sometimes I feel like grammar exercises are confusing on purpose, just to kind of just that's how it feels to me personally. So, and then you might need to create something new if you find that there's not enough student voices in the material that are out there. You have a unique need for your students. You teach like an upper level class where there's no OER. You teach a topic where there's never been an OER in that area before. And then also a good time to consider creating is if you can have some help because it can be a lot. There's a lot of different aspects of creating OER. And then scoping. So part of the scoping phase, so this is like step 3 of the workflow, the OER workflow that I showed in the beginning. So outlining the book is part of that process. There's different ways you can do it. So when I created an OER, it was for 2 classes. So there was a lot of material. It was for composition 1 and 2. And so this was all the readings for comp 1 and 2, but there's more than one way to structure the book. You could structure it using, the format that you teach the materials, the chronology or themes that you want to cover, which is another good reason why you might want to consider OER. But yeah, and then also part of this phase is figuring out the needs, the media needs of your project, and then picking out a publishing platform. And then you're on to phase 4. So developing the OER that you want to use in your class. So when I created OER, we did it collaboratively in Google Sheets and Google Docs. And this was so long ago, I don't remember if there was a reviewing toolbar in Google. We highlighted our additions in blue and then kept it in black. And the reason why we wanted to do that is we just wanted to know when the voice was like shifting, and when the material was shifting from our voice to from the original source. So this is different. This is totally different from like citing in an academic paper. In an academic paper, you're like super clear about, where the quote ends and begins. For OER, you can take someone else's material and blend it with your writing, and that's called adapting. This license allows for that. So that's why we chose to use it. So it can be a little bit confusing at first too, like thinking about how to attribute versus how to cite. So citing like with MLA or APA format, it's very strict when it comes to punctuation, right? Like your periods go here. You indent it like this. This is where the quotes go, right? If you're adapting someone else's Creative Commons licensed materials, you don't have to be quite as strict. You just want to be super clear, like when you're introducing someone else's ideas, and then you'll cite it at the end. But there isn't even really like a standard kind of citation the way that there is for style guides. There's just elements that you need to remember to include. So, like for me personally, adapting someone else's work felt like I was cheating at first. It felt like I was going to get in trouble. And that was just like all my years of being an English student and all my English student baggage. But I had to kind of push that away and just be like, okay, this is fine. The license allows for that. So for academic writing, if you're copying like, someone's ideas and not putting quotations around it or not putting a parenthetical citation, then technically you're plagiarizing, right? That's not the case with openly licensed materials. You definitely want to let people know when you're talking about someone else's work. But so for Creative Commons material, there's these 4 basic parts of an attribution. And so if you include all of these things, you'll be fine and you'll be following the rules of the license. So you're taking someone else's work, maybe you need to cite it or, yeah, attribute it. You'll want to include the title and then Hyperlinks are super important for this. So you put the title of the work and you want to link back to the original work because you want to like bring people's traffic back to that original author and properly attribute them. The author, so who wrote it, um, and also maybe link to like who they are, either their website or something like that, so that the reader would be able to, see who originally created it and maybe find other things they've developed. Source, where can people find the work? And you can just hyperlink the title and that would be sufficient for the source. The license too. You always want to include the license because that tells future people how to use the work as well. Um, so you want to link back to the license because, like I said before, when you do that, it's like you're stamping the material and saying this is CC license, and these are the rules you need to follow if you're using my intellectual property. Another thing to consider, accessibility. As you're creating and adapting materials, you want to make sure that it's accessible for all learners. So inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevents interaction with or access to websites by people with disabilities. So we have a whole other video on accessibility in our playlist that you can check out. And Melissa Herrera's here, and she's the one who talked about that, how to make your work accessible. So definitely check that out. But too much to cover in this. But just make sure, your alt you're tagging your images, you have descriptive hyperlinks, you're using headings. Just follow those rules for creating accessible materials you don't want to like get to the end of your project and then have to make everything accessible. It's like so much easier to do it little by little as you move along. Does anybody have questions? No? Okay, I'll keep going. So this phase isn't over yet. It's still really long. You made it accessible, you outline things, you're figuring out the platform, and then also before it goes to making it public, you want to make sure that you edit it. So if you're editing with others, that can be super helpful. Like the comments can be kind of like a space to discuss the content. When I was creating OER from within my department, we involved other people and we asked them for their feedback. We asked people to look at the content that we were putting into it and asking people if there was anything that was missing. And then also people gave us some comments within the actual document. And so the way that I got people to do that was I asked my dean if that could count as a service. So that way people weren't just doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, they could put it on their annual reviews as well. Sometimes proofreading can take as long as compiling a text. Maybe I'm just a slow proofreader, but that's what it really, really felt like. I think, yeah, if you're adapting it, it can take about as long. So I put this in here because actually with the consortium that we're creating, this editing process is actually being handled by our OER editor. So I wanted to make sure to let people know about that. If you're working in the consortium and you're developing a text, you can get help from our partners at the UNM Press. This is their logo phase. So you have a wonderfully formatted, accessible text, and now you want to put it into a platform to share with people. So Pressbooks and LibreText, I included these guys together because they allow you to import materials from other people's books directly into your own book, which can be a huge time saver. Both of them will retain the licensing of the original text too. And that's a step, like linking in LibreText. If you copy someone else's material, it'll just be appropriately cited as long as the original source was originally appropriately cited, right? Other platforms, so LibreText is free. Pressbooks is not free. We use Pressbooks and we do have a subscription for it through the NMOER consortium. LibreText is totally free though. It was created through a Department of Education grant. And then OER Commons is another place. And if you haven't searched OER Commons, there's so much material out there. Lesson plans, websites, lectures, videos. And so you can also create an account for free if it's just for like you. If you have an institution and they want to have like a big, huge page, that'll cost money. But for individuals, it doesn't cost. And they also have a publishing platform called Open Author. So you could publish on their platform for free as well. And then last steps. So you're creating or adapting something and you're getting close to the end. You want to think about like having some kind of a process for reviewing the book. How will it get updated in the future? You could like have a standing OER committee maybe that meets and talks about the material. You just want to like have some buy-in from other people to also to help you think about like how it should be revised later on once you pilot it. And then another step of this process is thinking about, you might want to have a peer review. So create a list of peers that are willing to review your book and give you feedback. So those are some of the last steps of this process. Here's just some resources. OER resources. This is our UNM website. And we have our Pressbooks website, which I should have put on there, but it's nmoer.pressbooks.pub. Questions about making OER. Is anybody working on something they'd like to talk about? I had a question relating to YouTube and Creative Commons. Sure, what is your question? I'll pull it up. Guy, what's your question about YouTube? Okay, so I was wondering specifically with fair use, how does music attribution work if you are referring to it in a work? Like citing it, I guess. And I'm also wondering if the music is openly licensed in your question. So YouTube is funny though. If you put copyrighted material into a video, it'll flag it and take it out like automatically. Oh, John, what do you think? Is there an amount of seconds that you could use?
I think if you're, as I understand the question, if you are teaching a course or a lecture on contemporary music and you have R&B and you want to talk about it in an educational context, I could see that we're not supposed to give any kind of advice, so this is not legal advice. I can
Yeah.
see that falling under fair use, but I can also see that YouTube may not really have the same view and would remove it anyway. So, um, yeah, and certainly, Guy, I've seen music that should be copyrighted in videos too. Um, it never hurts to contact the author or the creator. Um, it may be worth going to somewhere like the Internet Archive and finding an openly licensed example of an R&B song that would uh, allow that use is the strategy I would recommend. Um, so there is a fair use argument to be made, but I don't know that others would accept that argument.
You can also, when you're creating an OER material or an OER web page, you can embed a YouTube video. And so if you're linking back to the original source, as long as whoever posted it on YouTube had owned like the copyright, you can embed to something. And since like the play will show up on YouTube, then the person will, be acknowledged for that view. Embedding is totally fine. Embedding and linking to other sites that are not open is like that's super cool. Anybody else? Questions about adapting or creating OER? There's other places you can publish material too. Like I didn't put on there. A lot of people publish OER just by publishing in like a Google Drive folder. So that's another option that's totally free.
I forgot the website I went to. They had some free material. I think it was OER Common. So it was like link after link after link kind of thing. I was
Yes.
looking at a medical terminology because we don't have a dental terminology OER. So I found the medical terminology and I went to, again, link from link to link. And then it said it had the option of downloading as a PDF or a digital book. Anyways, and then it said to fills a form if you want to adopt it. So I kind of stopped there because I was like, are they asking money?
I don't think so. I think a lot of times people just want you to let they want to know if you're adopting their book
Mhm.
because they can like put it on their annual review or they
Okay.
can keep like the statistic of this is how many people have adopted my book.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think so. I would go for a whole book, but maybe a few portion of it. But yeah, I will explore more. But the question came to my mind like, then what's the use of saving money if they're charging? Okay.
Yeah, if they try to charge you, then it's definitely not an OER. But sometimes they just want to know. Like sometimes authors just want to know who's adopting their work so they can like just keep track of it to
Okay.
like keep track of the reach of their work.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. But that's a good question. Any other questions about adapting or creating OER? If you look on this page of the LibGuide, it has multimedia sites that have free Creative Commons music. Yeah, there is. There is also Openverse. Openverse has a bunch of open sound resources, and that's on that page. But it's cool because you can just download music. You want to make sure that it has an open enough license if you're going to use the material and adapt it. So like if it has a no derivatives license on it and it's music, you actually can only just listen to it. You can't like put it on the back of as background music on a YouTube video. That would be considered an adaptation. So some of this is a little bit kind of tricky at first. Thank you for coming to our adapting and creating OER session.